Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week we are going back to something that will make Kemper very happy and hopefully a lot of our listeners. We are going once again a marbling.
A marbling we go.
What are we doing this week, Kemper?
We are covering a short story entitled Strange Jest. Excellent title.
Very good title. I was very excited to hear it. Tell us a little bit about what the publication history is.
Sure. This one was first published in This Week in the US in November 1941, and then a whole 3 years later in the UK in July of 1944 in The Strand, under the title A Case of Buried Treasure, which is apt, not as good of a title, but that is descriptive, certainly. And apparently this is the last story that Christie wrote for The Strand, and many of the stories that we've covered thus far on the podcast were originally published in The Strand, yeah. So that's a big deal. It was then collected in 1950 in book form by Dodd Mead in the US in Three Blind Mice and Other Stories, which readers obviously know most for that titular story, which of course is in fact The Mousetrap, more famously known as The Mousetrap, i.e. the play that will go on running until the end of time. Forever. Like if there is a post-apocalyptic...
Our alien overlords will continue The Mousetrap.
Yes, our alien overlords will be taking in The Mousetrap daily.
It will have many more tentacles.
Right.
But
it'll still be our Mousetrap. Have you...
Or it will be all Terminators. Acting
a robot. It'll be an all-robot cast, but that's fine.
Right.
Have you seen The Mousetrap, Catherine?
I have seen The Mousetrap in the U.S. I have not seen The Mousetrap on the West End, actually.
You have not. I've only seen it on the West End. It's a delight. I think, part of what we've set out to do here on this podcast is to cover every single Agatha Christie story. I don't think we probably will end up covering The Mousetrap, though, because it's not even unspoken. At the end of the play, every viewer is instructed not to give away the ending so that other people can enjoy it. And I feel like in keeping with that spirit, we can't really spoil The Mousetrap on this podcast. That just wouldn't be good manners.
In fairness, at regional theaters around this country in particular, that play goes up probably every other year.
Oh, yeah.
So there's almost always a location where you can go see The Mousetrap.
Yeah, it's very easy to see The Mousetrap, and I'd say maybe second only to And Then There Were None. There's often a local amateur production of And Then There Were None, but The Mousetrap has got to be right up there too.
Well, I was last summer in Maine, and there were a few summer stock houses on the islands up there, like by Bar Harbor. And I swear, when I looked at, I pulled up their lists for previous years, and all of them had done a Christie play in the last year. Every single one of them.
Yeah, I mean, we don't talk enough about Christie as a playwright and her ongoing success around the world. I mean, we have mentioned this before, that we keep a Google alert for Agatha Christie, and I'd say 8 out of 10 of the alerts have to do with regional theater.
Plays.
Yeah. No, they do, and it's great. And that's part of the reason why, when we were covering And Then There Were None, the medium in which a lot of people seem to experience that story is actually as a play in some sort of local amateur production, because it is so ubiquitous.
I know.
So,
I mean, cool. And I just would like to say, as somebody who in high school was a regional theater ingenue, I really wish we had done a Christie, because I would have been absolutely delighted with my bad acting skills.
I do too. It would have been fun.
I know. Instead, local audiences were stuck with my performance, and You Can't Take It With You.
Hey, Pastor!
Oh, my.
I was in the chorus of Anything Goes.
I was Mary Warren in The Crucible.
Oh, wow.
When she come into the court, I say to myself, I must not accuse this woman, for she sleep in ditches and so very old and poor. But then she sit there, denying and denying. And I feel a misty coldness climbing up my back. And the skin on my skull begin to creep.
I know.
Oh, wow. Anyway, just to wrap up the publication history, published in the U.S. in Three Blind Mice and Other Stories in 1950, and then all the way in October 1979, it was collected in the U.K. in Miss Marple's Final Cases and Two Other Stories by Collins Crime, which was the last Christie book to be published under the Collins Crime label. So, look at that. I know. All the way in 1979. All right, Catherine, tell us about our victim.
Well, it's sort of Miss Marple, honestly. She is weirdly the victim and the hero at the same time because these garbage youths of today are pretty much taking advantage of and making fun of her. But said garbage use, Edward Rossiter and Charmian Stroud, which sounds like a toilet paper brand, are potential victims here as well as cousin lovers, as they are lacking the fortune that was supposedly given to them by their great mutual uncle, as in they literally can't find it.
Right. We are searching for buried treasure here, folks.
Yes, we are.
We've come across this a couple of times in Christie, which we will talk about as we get into it. So our suspect, quote unquote, we're obviously not in a puzzle mystery here, there's no murder, is great-great-uncle Matthew, who apparently hid his gift to the youngins a little bit too well before he died.
Right. So, the world as it appears to be. Jane Helier, I know, our actress friend from the Tuesday Night Club.
Are we saying Helier? I thought we decided we were going to say Helier.
It's been a while, so
yeah.
Helier. Yeah, maybe Helier.
Or either.
Can we start over again?
No, I think we were thinking that perhaps she insists on pronouncing her name as Helier, but it's probably really just Helier.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Right.
Well, she has invited an unusual guest to a fancy dinner club. And who is that guest? Kemper.
Miss Marple.
It's Miss Marple because her good friends Edward and Charmian are in a bit of a pickle. They were off enjoying the posh life, in large part because they had expected to come into a small fortune from their dear great Uncle Matthew, as they're his only relatives, and they were very fond of him. And his estate, Anstey's, they've also inherited, and they were going to marry each other and move to.
Right. So
they're kissing cousins.
They're totally kissing cousins who we first came across in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And this story for me made me think of a lot of other Christie stories. And first up, we've got actually the Listerdale mystery, one of Catherine's favorites, and that would actually be the titular story within the Listerdale Mystery Collection, because in that story, we had this whole framework of a family on hard times, and they had been forced to sell their family estate. And what was their family estate called? Anstey's. The exact same name, which is interesting. And I remember on that episode, I was theorizing that Christie was thinking of her own beloved childhood home, which was Ashfield, not too far off from Anstey's. And when Mrs. St. Vincent in that story was sort of waxing romantic about how lovely it used to be, Christie was certainly thinking of the idyllic childhood that she had with her parents there, and especially even her mother and that whole relationship. And
right.
It's just really funny to me that she used the exact same name 16 years later, because the Listerdale Mystery was first published in 1925, and this story was first published in 1941. I would love for there to be a sort of continuity between the two stories, but I checked, and in that story too, Anstey's is held out to be a kind of ancient familial home. And it seems to be the same here. So, you know what? My only theory could be that great-great-uncle Matthew, it was actually the buyer 16 years earlier from poor Mrs. St. Vincent of Anstey's, and he's just held it out as an ancient family estate. So, you know what? I wouldn't put it past great-great-uncle Matthew, because he is a bit of a character. So that's my conspiracy theory.
I like this. I really enjoy this. It seems very much in keeping with great Uncle Matthew.
Well, more on great Uncle Matthew. Unfortunately for Edward and Charmian, he got increasingly suspicious as he got older and increasingly weird about his money and the idea that people were going to steal from him. So this led to him withdrawing money from his bank accounts and hiding it. And as he is dying, his only clue to Edward and Charmian is to point to his eye and wink. That's really it.
Helpful.
Yeah, it's not much. And, suffice to say, it's not really very helpful to them. So they have just gone ahead and dug up approximately 2 acres of poor Anstey's in and around the estate, digging for buried treasure. And that actually reminded me, this is the second story I wanted to bring up. Remember when we were covering Partners in Crime? The Tommy and Tuppence short story collection. There was a story. It was the clergyman's daughter. Although it encompassed 2 chapters, was the clergyman's daughter in the Red House.
Well, it's yet another story where Tommy gets knocked over the head, right?
Of course. I mean, I almost defy you to find a story involving Tommy and Tuppence in which Tommy does not get knocked over the head, but sure. But they go to an estate and they're looking for some sort of buried treasure. There are other reference points between that story and this one, which we will get to later on. But it also made me think of that one. That was a very early Christie story as well. I think that was even from 1923. So this just has like a lightness to it that feels like early, almost thrillery Christie. And it is very unusual to have such a light story that involves Miss Marple.
Right.
This is a bit of an outlier, but I would argue, I think it works. I was pretty delighted by this story.
I know, because the next thing that Miss Marple does is that it's unclear whether or not she thinks this happens or if she misunderstands, but she accepts an invitation to Anstey's from Charmian that Charmian probably did not intend.
Right. Like from the beginning, they're very puzzled by Miss Marple and by Jane Helier's confidence in her. And I also even love, we kind of glossed over this, but I love the scene setting in the beginning of Jane Helier inviting old, fluffy, what have you, Miss Marple to this swanky party. Because it's even mentioned, like they end up having to go to another location because it's too noisy for them to really tell her the whole story. And Christie writes that Charmian led the way out of the overcrowded and smoke-laden room. And they went to the stairs to a small sitting room on the second floor. And just imagining this kind of like louche, swanky party of like people lounging with cigarettes and cocktails. And Miss Marple's like sitting there with her knitting. Just being like, hello.
I really like it. Really like it.
So what does Miss Marple do when she arrives at Anstey's as a potentially uninvited guest?
Well, they give her the grand tour around the estate, which, again, they have mostly dug up. Like, the grounds, which are supposedly pristine in the past, are just filled with holes.
Right.
They've been straight up just digging up the yards. And the contents of the house, too, have just been, like, rifled through and pulled apart. The whole thing is a mess. And during all this, Miss Marple tells 2 somewhat bizarre anecdotes, one of which is about her uncle, who apparently was somewhat similar to Matthew, and the other is about Mrs. Eldridge in St. Mary Mead, who had a maid who was a little too good at shining floors, to the point where Mrs. Eldridge wiped out in her bathroom and had to be saved. Embarrassingly, it's kind of implied that she was probably naked by her gardener, who had to climb in through the window.
Don't come in. I'm naked.
What? Oh, Jesus.
My neck pulled again, and this is the only way I felt comfortable. I'll get up. Ow!
Okay, don't get up. I'm coming in.
No! Don't come in. I'm fine. Ow! I can't get up.
Okay, I'm coming in.
Oh, God.
Well, I believe that the purpose of the Mrs. Eldridge story is that the maid was overdoing it right? So
correct. That is the purpose of the story.
That's all she was trying to say. I mean, it's so great because at this point, as readers of Miss Marple and connoisseurs of the lovely Miss Marple, we know what she's doing when she's making these references. Her mind is collecting information and using the people who she knows as reference points to figure out what all this actually means. But to Edward and Charmian, they just got referred to her by Jane Helier, who, by the way, not the brightest bulb.
Bit of a dum-dum, Jane.
Yes. Jane is a bit of a dum-dum. So they have very little confidence in Miss Marple. And most of this story, and this is where the real comedy comes in, is just in their increasing doubt, almost to the point of being driven crazy. Like, the more that Miss Marple babbles, the crazier they get, until this was my favorite line by far in this story, and like almost any Miss Marple short story that we've come across, where finally Charmian says, "Are we mad or are you?" They're so not into what Miss Marple is serving.
By the way, though, she doesn't make it easy for herself.
No. Well, it's almost like Miss Marple. This is going to support your dark Marple theory, Catherine. I think Miss Marple is trolling them.
I totally agree.
They're driving her, like, she's driving them crazy, and I think she's kind of enjoying it.
Right. But to go back to the story about her Uncle Henry, it is about his interest in teasing the younger generation. Namely, he did things like putting bags of treats slightly too high for children to reach, which I think is really funny. But it's not described as being out of spite, but out of this kind of delight of being old and a bachelor and having a crooked sense of humor.
Right.
She very pointedly tells a story. And Edward and Charmian are like,
they're like, Uncle Henry sounds awful.
Yes. Uncle Henry sounds like the worst person.
No, I mean, Charmian literally says, "I think he sounds horrible." Christie writes, Edward felt that if he heard any more about Uncle Henry, he'd go mad.
Which, like, fair enough.
Yeah.
But they're basically, like, desperate, so they let Miss Marple go through all of Matthew's papers anyway.
Right. And they also, we're going to get to the world as it actually is with some clues. And I promise I'll stop reading random little bits from the story that amused me. But I also really appreciated they've just been doing all this babbling about various things, and they're fed up with Miss Marple. And then she says, Miss Marple was like, "Oh, but we've got to find the money, haven't we? You mustn't give up, Mr. Rossiter. If at first you don't succeed, try again." And then he says, "You mean you're going to go on trying?" And then Miss Marple says, "Strictly speaking, I haven't begun yet." And then she starts reading. She starts reading again from like this random recipe. She's like, "First catch your hare, as Mrs. Beeton says in her cookery book. A wonderful book, but terribly expensive. Most of the recipes begin, take a quart of cream and a dozen eggs. Let me see, where was I? Oh, yes." And you're just imagining like the two of them with their like eyes bugging out, and they're like pulling at their hair. Just, oh my God, get this woman out of our house now.
Like, who did we let in? Like, we let in the Cat in the Hat.
Yeah. Yeah, it has this sort of like madcap kind of like the Cat in the Hat is actually like an apt reference. She's creating mayhem. It's so devious.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so eventually we do get to a resolution of sorts here by way of some clues, and both of the anecdotes, of course, that Miss Marple tells about other people are clues, because they always are. And again, we as astute readers and connoisseurs of Marple already knew that. So let's first talk about the maid being too good at her job. And we already covered this, but the deduction is that Uncle Matthew was being a little too good at his job of leaving money to the younger generation. So he was a little too clever about hiding it. So we know that whatever means he used to hide it just has to be a bit ridiculous, and that certainly would also be in keeping with the tone of this story. So we should just be looking for something outlandish.
Right. And then clue number 2 is very much related, and it's a story about Uncle Henry liking a good tease, because the deduction here is the nod to Uncle Matthew pointing at his eye, which was supposed to be like a clever clue, but it was too clever by far.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
So he thought this was like a grand tease about like, oh, won't this be like a fun adventure? Except he really overestimated his errors.
Yeah. So Miss Marple, the first thing she says that actually makes sense and helps get us toward a solution here. It has to do with where a man such as great Uncle Matthew would have hidden whatever his treasure is. And she says the obvious place a man of means and of business would hide something would be his desk. And Edward and Charmian are like, no, we've already looked there, obviously. We even found the hidden compartment that is in this massive desk, so it can't be that. But Miss Marple knows a little bit better than them, doesn't she?
Yeah, so she looks at the hidden compartment knowingly, which is totally empty, and she notes that sometimes things can be hidden in smaller things.
There's such a thing as a secret inside a secret, is what she says.
Yeah. And so she pulls out a bobby pin from her gray hair.
Her what hair?
And her gray hair.
I thought that Miss Marple, as first introduced in the 13 Problems at Tuesday Night Club, had piles of fluffy white hair, Catherine. Is she aging backwards?
She's Benjamin Buttoning.
She really is Benjamin Buttoning. She's not even Peter Panning because she is getting younger. I mean, this is where it's like the more that Christie wrote about her, the younger she wrote her because she needed her to be robust.
Right.
It's really funny.
So,
I love that she refers to her gray hair here because she definitely did not have gray hair in those first stories.
No, and she was wearing weird lacy caps.
Right, and now she's she wears more tweedy kind of gardening-y outfits as opposed to mantillas of lace.
Right. So she pulls out a bobby pin from her gray bob or gray bun, rather, sorry.
Let's not go too far.
I know. Super, super mod. Her gray bun. And she finds what looks like, I guess, a wormhole in this hidden compartment, and she uses the straight pin, whatever it is, to insert it. It takes a little effort on her part, but it forces open another secret compartment. And in that secret compartment, there is a treasure trove of love letters.
Right. And Edward and Charmian are shocked because Uncle Matthew was a lifelong bachelor. These are all romantic letters written to him by a missionary in Hawaii, which...
Oh my gosh, Agatha!
Well, let's never forget, Agatha was in Hawaii herself. She surfed standing up, apparently one of the first Westerners to do that. She was there with her first husband, Archie. It was a long time ago. We got a lot of that setting and color in The Man in the Brown Suit, at least from the South Africa portion of that trip. And this missionary, this supposed missionary in Hawaii, is named Betty Martin. Edward and Charmian are convinced that the letters have some sort of secret code in them, or that there's invisible ink, and if they make the invisible ink appear, it will read out directions for where the treasure actually is. But unfortunately for them, there's no invisible ink, or at least so says Miss Marple, right? She tells them that they are perhaps overlooking something much more obvious.
Right, and it's oddly enough Edward who finally gets a clue. He's still looking at the letters and the ink, and then he realizes, based on Miss Marple pointing him to the signature, that the ink is much more recent than the envelopes. In other words, the letters were written after the envelopes they were apparently sent in. They're fake. So Uncle Matthew must have written them essentially like a novel.
Right. By the way, Miss Marple is, of course, an expert on invisible ink, since in Motive versus Opportunity, that story did hinge on invisible or evanescent ink, as it was referred to in that story, but not so much in this one. So why would Uncle Matthew have faked these letters from a missionary to him? And Miss Marple says, well, because he'd like to have his little joke. Again, her Uncle Henry, great-great-Uncle Matthew, was very much like her Uncle Henry. And Miss Marple says, you're holding the money in your hand right now. You just don't see it. There is technically another clue that gets us there, but we did not include that in our list of clues because, like Edward and Charmian, we were a bit mystified by this clue.
Well, and also it's not a clue earlier. It's a very late clue. Yeah. And Miss Marple literally has to spell it out.
If any listener here, after reading that Uncle Matthew tapped his eye and then read that the missionary's name was Betty Martin, if anyone got to this place without Miss Marple explaining it, I want to hear from you, because what's wrong with you?
And right, seriously. If you respond to us saying, oh, well, this was obvious, I am going to just think you're a liar.
What is the phrase, all my eye and Betty Martin, Catherine?
So it is a Britishism from the 1700s. Apparently, to get things out of the way, it means disbelief. It's a way to declare absurdity, and its origins are like slightly unclear. But most of the variants involve a misunderstanding of a Latin prayer.
Right, which was invoking a Saint Martin, I believe, right? So it's kind of like
Correct.
It's a way of indicating this is all rubbish, this is all nonsense, because the Betty Martin is this ridiculous bastardization of Saint Martin, of something that was like much more serious and is now made silly, right? That's my kind of understanding of it.
Yeah.
I do find it interesting that the phrase dates back to the 1700s, because Betty Martin, I mean, it makes sense that Betty Martin is a name that would have the same sort of import as just like a normal lady's name in the 1700s, but it sounds much more modern to my ear. Like, to me, this sounds like something from the 30s, the 1930s, but...
it certainly, Betty, I suppose, certainly does.
Yeah.
Like, I would say it's Becky Sharp and Vanity Fair, right?
No, I mean, Betty Martin is a name that could easily be for 300 years old. It's just, for whatever reason, it just doesn't sound that way to me. But then when I thought about it for 2 seconds, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's funny to me that it's such an old phrase, and it's also just like its jocularity is also feels a little more modern to me. But obviously, people needed to be jocular back in the 1700s too. So there's also a bit of hijinks with this recipe for boiled ham, which is the only other item that they find within the secret drawer inside the secret drawer other than those letters. And she's like, baked ham with spinach, take a nice piece of gammon, stuff with cloves and cover with brown sugar, bake in a slow oven, serve with a border of pureed spinach. What do you think of that now? And Edward's like, I think it sounds filthy. She's like, no, actually it would be very good. And its main ingredients are gammon and spinach, which is itself another phrase for nonsense. So this is yet another clue, in addition to the All My Eye and Betty Martin, that indicates the substance of the treasure that they found is meaningless and that they should look on the outside of it. But I also wanted to make a reference to yet another Christie story, because this reminded me of the Parker Pine story that we covered, the case of the city clerk. And in that story, there was also a little bit of funny business involving a recipe for boiled ham. It's totally a throwaway reference in there. It's at the very beginning of the story, but clearly Christie found the notion of a recipe for boiled ham being in any way significant just funny. I think sometimes authors, like people everywhere in the world, have specific things that tickle their fancy, and clearly recipes for boiled ham was just something that Christie found amusing. So it's just funny that she made use of the same little joke in two different stories, and that Parker Pine story was first published in 1932. This was a joke that really endured for her. So what Miss Marple is saying is that by tapping his eye and then having this character, Betty Martin, in these letters, he was conveying that phrase to them, which they were then supposed to use to deduce that the letters themselves are rubbish, these letters that he created himself, but the envelopes that contain the letters are not. It's helpful that we did come across this idea in another story that we covered, which is The Missing Will. That was a Poirot short story from Poirot Investigates. And in that one, too, the idea was that there were these dirty envelopes that were made to hang off of a key in an otherwise very tidy study, and they were looking for this missing will, obviously, and Poirot realized that it was the only thing that was out of place in the study was this dirty envelope, and funnily enough, written in invisible ink on the dirty envelope was the missing will. So again, that story, reminds me of that Poirot Investigates story, and then just the other reference point with the Tommy and Tuppence story that I already mentioned, The Clergyman's Daughter and The Red House, is that they reference in the story Arsène Lupin, who is another another kind of early 20th century master of disguise and master criminal creation, which is very much like one of those references that we got in the Partners in Crime collection when Christie was making contemporary references to other mystery writers and just the characters within those stories. I think that the actual writer of the Arsène Lupin series was Maurice Leblanc. This story so feels like that Tommy and Tuppence story to me. And again, I just can't overstate how weird that is, that this is a Miss Marple story and it has that kind of madcap flavor to it. But again, I think it works. It's just a side of Miss Marple we don't normally see.
Yeah, but so you're missing the main point about the envelopes.
Sure. Yeah. So what about these envelopes, Catherine, is so valuable? It's not invisible ink.
The envelopes are stamped. And Miss Marple immediately has eyed a stamp from 1851 on one of the envelopes, which makes no logical sense. And it's a stamp that she knows, because of course she does, that it's worth about 25,000 pounds.
Well, do you know why she knows it? Because her great nephew, Lionel, because Miss Marple is a great aunt herself. That would be Raymond and Joan West's son, Lionel, is a stamp collector. He's very passionate. Such a dear little boy and a passionate stamp collector. Knows all about stamps. It was he who told me about the rare and expensive stamps and that a wonderful new find had come up for auction. And this is the actual one that she is seeing now. So, again, Raymond West is responsible here in some
Wait, do we know for a fact that that's Raymond West's son?
It's not mentioned within this story, but we do know that he has two sons, Lionel, and I forget what the other one is named, but I think we'll learn in a later Miss Marple story.
All right.
It's Raymond's
just making
son.
sure.
Yeah, it's Raymond's son. Plus, by the way, I mean her only other named niece or nephew was Mabel. Remember, from the Thumb Mark of St. Peter? I don't think she's getting cozy with Mabel's kids if Mabel went on to get remarried and have kids, but I suppose it's possible.
I mean, I would have thought maybe it was a possibility, but
no, this is I'm fairly certain this is Raymond West's son.
So yeah, and then she makes a guess that the other stamps are probably equally valuable. So essentially, Uncle Matthew's joke, which has gone way too far, was that he had invested his life savings in rare stamps, hid them in a drawer, wrote fictional letters, and hoped his heirs would figure it out.
And then just tapped his eye as he was kicking the bucket.
Right.
And was like, they'll figure it all out.
My favorite thing is the fact that they're like, oh gosh, Miss Marple, we would have burned these.
Yeah. Edward is beside himself because he knows that if it weren't for Miss Marple, they definitely would have burned the envelopes because it was the decent, gentlemanly way to burn these kind of embarrassing letters. And Miss Marple has one final Uncle Henry story to tell them, which is when he sent a favorite niece a £5 note for a Christmas present, put it in a Christmas card, gummed the card together, wrote love and best wishes, afraid this is all I can manage this year. And the girl was so ticked off that she threw it in the fire. She just burned it. So that could have happened here with Uncle Matthew, but it did not because of Miss Marple. And the story ends with them getting a bottle of champagne and drinking the health of, yes, Uncle Henry.
I like it.
It's good. It's so silly. It's very, very silly, but
it's very charming.
It's really charming. Yeah. The Miss Marple short stories, they're quite a mixed bag. They differ in tone.
But this one is particularly charming.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. Miss Marple is often light and diverting, even in novel form, but I don't know if I would usually say they were funny. And this one is its most prominent characteristic, I'd say, is that it's humorous.
Yeah, it is.
So that brings us to an end of Strange Jest. We will be covering a novel for next time. We're so excited. Finally, we will be discussing Sparkling Cyanide.
Kemper's really excited because it turns out he's a huge Colonel Race.
Oh my God.
Fanatic.
Such a huge Colonel Race fan. And you know what? We even get a reference to Inspector Battle in this novel.
Oh my gosh. So. Superintendent Battle.
So you're right. How dare I? Superintendent Battle.
Give him his proper due, Kemper.
We've we've already covered our last Superintendent Battle novel, which was Toward Zero, and I believe this is our final Colonel Race novel. It's been quite a ride. We saw him in The Man in the Brown Suit, and then, of course, Cards on the Table, and then Death on the Nile, which is probably his biggest adventure.
Finest hour.
His finest hour. And now we have Sparkling Cyanide. We very much look forward to discussing that, and we would love to hear from you. Before we do, join us on Patreon. We have posted our second Patreon episode, which is all about the BBC radio adaptations of Agatha Christie's novels, focusing on Five Little Pigs.
Five Little Pigs.
Yeah, as performed by John Moffat. But we did sort of an overview of what is out there and just the radio adaptations themselves and the medium of the radio play and what that means as an adaptational form. We had a great time discussing just one aspect of the consumption of Christie that we just don't cover on this podcast. So if you'd like to check that out, please do. Patreon.com/allaboutagatha. You can email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. Catherine is at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and our Instagram handle is at All About Agatha. And we would love it if you would rate and review us and help other people find the podcast. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.